Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Johnson, and I'm a senior political science major here at Santa Clara University. And here's my honors senior thesis presentation. Here's some of the things that we're going to be talking about. The focus of my thesis was the gubernatorial elections in Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. And I tried to see which types of candidates were rewarded in these particular swing states. I first began by discussing the national environment that each of these particular candidates were operating in. So as we know, there is record high inflation going into the 2022 midterms, with consumer prices up 7.7% over the year, the largest increases for food and energy. However, President Biden did have a fairly low unemployment rate. And as we know, presidents going into midterm elections with a low unemployment rate tend to do well overall. However, President Biden's approval rating was fairly low, similar to President Trump's going into 2018 at around 38%. Another issue for this particular election was the future of democracy. After the failed re-election bid by President Trump, he continued to deny those election results and endorsed candidates all across the country who fed into his election lies. Additionally, Roe v. Wade was overturned by the conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, making abortion a very potent issue for the electorate. Now, in trying to determine what type of candidate each person was, I first began by analyzing their platform within the context of their particular political party's platform from the 2020 election and seeing if there's any distinguishing factors between the two of those. Then I moved on and analyzed the candidate's Twitter account from October 24th to October 31st in 2022. I chose this particular week because it was right before the election, but it wasn't the week of the election where the candidates would simply be utilizing get out the vote efforts. So in determining what types of tweets each candidate was sending out, I divided it up into three categories: moderation slash governability driven, negative or partisan driven, policy driven, and miscellaneous. Now, starting with moderation slash governability driven, a tweet would fall into this category if they were trying to emphasize their own ability to govern, whether or not their opponent was too radical for their particular state. Moving on, I also determined whether or not a candidate was overly partisan or engaged in a significant amount of negative campaigning. This would be anything that directly went against their opponent, or if they tried to help their own political allies. Next, I tried to determine if a particular tweet was policy driven by seeing if they're pushing for any particular policy or they're making their stance on a public policy issue clear. Now, something would be miscellaneous if it didn't fall into these particular categories or if they weren't trying to make their case directly to voters. This typically involved tweets that were generic get out the vote efforts. Now, a tweet can also fall into many of these categories at the same time. For instance, if someone is trying to emphasize their own moderation or governability as opposed to their opponent, this would count as both a negative partisan driven tweet as well as a moderation slash governability driven tweet. Our first state was Arizona, which saw an election between former TV host Carrie Lake as well as former state Secretary of State Katie Hobbs. Starting with Ms. Lake, her platform was very closely aligned to the GOP platform, but primarily she tied herself to President Trump. This involved a lot of his election conspiracies as well as different conservative priorities. Now, looking specifically at her Twitter, her messaging was very heavy on negative attacks against Katie Hobbs as well as partisanship, with 53% of her total tweets relating to this. Moving on to Katie Hobbs, her platform is also not too distinct from the Democratic National Committee's platform as well. However, she was tailored her issues a bit more to Arizona specifically, as opposed to broader culture war issues. Her messaging also focused on emphasizing her own governability and moderation. And for these distinctions, I categorize Carrie Lake as partisan driven and Katie Hobbs as governability driven. Moving on to the state of Georgia. This election saw a rematch between former minority leader of the Georgia House of Representatives, Stacey Abrams, and incumbent Governor Brian Kemp. Now, starting with Ms. Abrams, her platform was not very distinct from the 2020 DNC platform, although some of her issues are more tailored to the citizens of Georgia. Moving on to her messaging on Twitter, the majority of those tweets that relate to making her case to voters focused on negative attacks for partisanship. Now, moving on to incumbent Governor Brian Kemp, his platform had an emphasis on conservative priorities. However, he did distinguish himself from the former president when he didn't go along with his election lies in 2020, which made him a bit less partisan, although still very conservative. Now, in terms of his messaging on Twitter, he did have a bit of an emphasis on policy prescription, although there were a lot less tweets to go off of. Now, for these reasons, I determined that Abrams was more of a partisan candidate. And for Kemp, while emphasizing his conservative policy priorities, but distinguishing himself from the head of his political party, I determined that he was more policy-driven. Moving on to the state of Pennsylvania, this election was very similar to that of Arizona in that we had a Trump-endorsed candidate on the GOP side, as well as a statewide elected official on the Democratic side. Now, first focusing on Mastriano, platform listed on his website focused on a lot of Republican culture war ideals in line with that of President Trump, including stop the steal, as well as ending vaccine mandates and ending different COVID restrictions. Now, in terms of his messaging on Twitter, there was a distinct emphasis on negative attacks / partisanship, trying to attack Josh Shapiro for crime in the state, being that Shapiro was the attorney general of the state of Pennsylvania at the time. Now, moving on to Josh Shapiro, his platform was also in line with the DNC's priorities, although there was a bit more of an emphasis on issues specifically pertaining towards Pennsylvania. He was also able to run on his record as attorney general, as well as other positions he's had for elected office. Now, in terms of his messaging on Twitter, of those messages that pertained directly to making a case to voters, there was a distinct emphasis on his own governability, / moderation, with contrast to his opponent, Doug Mastriano. Now, for these reasons, I categorize Doug Mastriano as more partisan-driven and Josh Shapiro as more governability / moderation-driven. Finally, although we are unable to conclude what types of candidates would be most rewarded in these swing states in 2022, we can see which types of candidates are least rewarded. Now, in these particular swing states, the more partisan-driven candidates did not achieve victory. They engaged in a lot of negative campaigning and focusing a lot more on their opponent as opposed to what they wanted to do for their particular states. Now, this can show that, at least among the electorate in these particular states, there's a desire for a sense of normalcy, for governments to move past gridlock, move past hyperpartisanship, and actually get things done for the American people. Now, we'll see if this is actually realized going forward, but it's an important development among the electorate. Now, thank you for listening to my thesis presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.